All right. Ready to dive into some seriously big questions?
Always up for a challenge.
Today we're tackling Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion.
Oh, Dawkins. He doesn't hold back, does he?
Not one bit. And we've got quite the excerpt from you, so let's jump right in. This book dives headfirst into some controversial territory.
It absolutely does. And he wastes no time getting to the heart of it with what he calls the God hypothesis.
The God hypothesis.
Yeah, it sounds kind of formal, almost scientific when you say it like that.
So what's Dawkins getting at with this hypothesis idea?
Well, it's his way of saying, look, whether you believe in God or not, let's treat the whole idea of God's existence like a scientific theory.
Instead of just a matter of faith.
Right. Like any other claim in science, show me the evidence.
Interesting. So he's not approaching this from a place of spirituality, but more from a point of logic and evidence.
Exactly. He's applying that same kind of critical thinking you'd use in a lab to the concept of a higher power.
So is he saying that God definitively doesn't exist?
Well, not quite. His central argument is more about probability, that based on the evidence we have, or rather don't have the God hypothesis, is just statistically improbable.
Okay, so how does he back that up?
Well, he uses this really clever analogy of an orbiting teapot. Imagine, he says, that there's a teapot out in space, somewhere between Earth and Mars, just orbiting the sun.
A teapot. Okay, I'm definitely picturing it. This should be good.
Now, we can't prove with absolute certainty that this teapot isn't out there, right? Space is massive.
Sure enough, it's not like we've examined every cubic inch of the solar system.
But just because we can't definitively prove it's not there, should we go around assuming that this teapot exists? Especially without any evidence.
Good point. It would be pretty wild to just accept that a teapot is casually orbiting the sun without any observation or reason to think it's actually up there.
Exactly. And Dawkins says it's the same with the God hypothesis. He argues that the lack of concrete evidence for God's existence should lead us to question the likelihood of it being true.
So if we follow that line of thinking, wouldn't the most logical stance be agnosticism? That whole, maybe God exists, maybe not, we just can't know for sure kind of thing.
That's where things get really interesting. Dawkins actually addresses agnosticism head-on. He gets that it seems like the comfortable middle ground, a way to avoid taking a definitive side.
And it seems like a pretty reasonable position to take, right? No one can really claim to know for sure.
Right. But Dawkins argues that when you really examine the probabilities, agnosticism becomes a bit harder to hold on to. He talks about this spectrum of belief. On one end, you've got the die-hard theists, completely certain in their faith. On the other end are the staunch atheists, equally convinced that there's no higher power.
And most people probably fall somewhere in between those two extremes, right?
That's his point. He suggests that when you really dig into the evidence, or lack thereof, you'll likely find yourself leaning more towards one side or the other than you might initially realize.
So it's about really examining where you land on that spectrum, not just camping out in the middle out of convenience or a fear of being wrong.
It's about intellectual honesty. But Dawkins doesn't stop at critiquing the idea of God in general. He takes aim at those classic arguments that people have used to support God's existence for centuries. Stuff like the first cause argument, the argument from design, these big philosophical concepts.
And he just dismantles them.
He challenges them, picks them apart to see if they really hold up under scrutiny. Take the first cause argument, for example, the idea that everything has to have a cause, and if you trace that chain back far enough, you'll get to some ultimate first cause, which is God.
It's an idea that's been around for a long time, for sure. How does Dawkins counter that one?
Well, he acknowledges that it's a question that has puzzled philosophers and theologians for centuries. But he suggests that just slapping the label of God onto that first cause doesn't actually solve anything. It just kicks the can down the road.
What do you mean?
Well, if everything needs a cause, then who or what caused God? You run into this infinite regression problem.
It's like asking, what caused the cause of the cause of the cause? And so on, forever. You'd never get anywhere.
You got it. And that's what Dawkins argues, that instead of resorting to these kind of skyhooks, these explanations that try to explain everything without really explaining anything.
We need something more concrete.
Something we can actually test and observe. And for Dawkins, that something is evolution. He sees evolution as a more plausible, scientifically grounded explanation for the complexity and diversity of life that we see all around us.
And this is where his arguments start to get really interesting, especially when he applies them to other classic arguments for God, like the argument from design.
Right. The idea that the universe is so intricate and complex that it just has to be the work of some intelligent designer.
It's a popular one. And when you look at the sheer complexity of nature, it's easy to see why some people jump to a divine creator.
Right, but here's where Dawkins flips the script. He says, okay, if the universe needs a designer because it's so complex, then wouldn't that designer God have to be even more complex?
Which would then require an explanation for their existence. And we're right back at that infinite regression problem.
Precisely. He argues that it becomes a circular argument. He even coins this memorable phrase, blind watchmaker.
Blind watchmaker. I like that. It really gets you thinking. So we've got the first cause argument, the argument from design. What other big ones does Dawkins take on?
Well, he also tackles the argument from beauty, the idea that the beauty and wonder we find in the natural world are evidence of a divine hand at work.
That one definitely resonates with a lot of people, I think. That sense of awe and wonder you feel when you're in nature, gazing at a sunset or looking up at a starry sky, it's often intertwined with spirituality.
Absolutely. But Dawkins throws a bit of a curveball into that line of thinking.
Hmm.
He suggests that maybe, just maybe, art and creativity would actually flourish more without the constraints of religion.
Now that's an interesting thought. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Well, he uses Shakespeare as an example. He asks us to imagine if Shakespeare was limited to writing plays that only glorified the church. Would we still have masterpieces like Hamlet or
Yeah.
Macbeth? Plays that grapple with doubt, ambition, the darker aspects of human nature?
Probably not. It does make you wonder if sometimes imposing religious themes on art can actually stifle creativity instead of nurturing it.
It's a provocative thought, for sure.
It definitely is. But those examples are all about the natural world, about art. What about the more personal side of faith? The miracles, the visions, those profound spiritual experiences that some people claim as direct evidence of God's presence. How does Dawkins address those kinds of arguments?
Well, he dives right into specific examples, like the famous story of the 70,000 people at Fatima who supposedly witnessed the sun dancing in the sky.
Oh, wow, that's a story that's been passed down for generations. It's seen as a powerful example of a miraculous event, a sign from above.
And if it were true, it would seemingly defy our current understanding of physics, right? Dawkins doesn't deny that it's a compelling story. He even acknowledges that it's difficult to explain how 70,000 people could simultaneously misinterpret or hallucinate the same event.
So he's open to the possibility that something unusual happened.
He's open to exploring different explanations, but he argues that, however unlikely it might seem, mass delusion or misinterpretation is still a more probable explanation than the laws of physics being momentarily suspended.
So it becomes a question of what's more likely, a mass delusion or a genuine violation of the laws of nature. It really makes you think about the nature of belief and how our minds interpret extraordinary events.
Absolutely. And this leads to one of Dawkins' most thought-provoking ideas, his theory of the misfiring byproduct.
Okay, I'll admit, when I first read about the misfiring byproduct, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Could you walk me through it?
Sure. Imagine a moth drawn to a flame. It's a natural instinct, right?
Mhm.
Usually helps the moth navigate by the light of the moon. But when artificial lights are introduced, that same instinct, that usually beneficial attraction, can be fatal.
So the moth is acting on an instinct that's hardwired into its DNA, but that instinct isn't equipped to deal with this new artificial situation.
Exactly. And Dawkins suggests that our attraction to religion might be a similar kind of misfiring. He proposes that religion, with its promise of comfort, meaning, and answers to life's big questions, might be tapping into some of our most primal instincts. Instincts that might have served us well in our evolutionary past, but now in the face of modern knowledge and understanding.
They might be leading us astray.
That's the gist of it. It's not that religion is inherently bad or harmful. He just questions whether it's ultimately based on a true representation of reality.
It makes you wonder then where our sense of morality comes from. If it's not divinely ordained, if it's not handed down from on high, then how do we even define right and wrong? And speaking of morality, this brings us to one of the more challenging aspects of Dawkins' argument. His take on those rather unsettling passages often found in religious texts.
Ah, yes. He doesn't shy away from those, does he?
Not at all. In fact, he dives right into the Old Testament, highlighting stories like the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
And those are just a couple of examples. He also points to the often brutal treatment of women and children, the punishments for what we would now consider minor offenses.
It's hard to reconcile those stories, those actions, with the image of a loving and merciful God that many religions espouse.
Exactly. And that's precisely his point. He uses these examples to highlight the tension between our modern moral sensibilities and some of the moral codes presented in these ancient texts.
So if our morals aren't divinely ordained, then where do they come from? How do we navigate right and wrong in a world where those absolute decrees aren't so absolute anymore? And more importantly, how do we raise our children with a sense of ethics and morality in a world where those lines can seem so blurry?
And that leads us to one of the most controversial aspects of the God delusion, Dawkins' views on children and faith.
This is where things get really interesting because he doesn't mince words. He straight up calls teaching faith to children a form of abuse. It's a strong statement that's sure to evoke strong reactions from people, both religious and non-religious. So why does he take such a firm stance on this issue?
Well, for Dawkins, it boils down to this idea of indoctrination, of imprinting a belief system onto a child before they have the cognitive ability to truly understand or question what they're being taught.
He's basically saying that it robs children of the opportunity to form their own beliefs, their own understanding of the world.
Exactly. He believes that children should be exposed to a wide range of ideas and beliefs, encouraged to think critically and come to their own conclusions about the world, rather than being force-fed doctrines and dogmas. To illustrate his point, he brings up the rather disturbing historical example of Edgardo Mortara.
Edgardo Mortara.
He was a young Jewish boy who was taken from his family and raised Catholic after a servant claimed to have baptized him.
Oh, wow. That's a chilling story. And it really highlights the potential dangers of religious extremism, of how easily deeply held beliefs can be used to justify horrific acts.
And for Dawkins, it emphasizes the importance of critical thinking, of allowing children the space to question and explore different ideas without fear of reprisal or eternal damnation.
It definitely makes you think about the power of belief systems and how they're passed down through generations. I mean, think about your own childhood. How many of us grew up hearing about heaven and hell, about eternal reward or eternal damnation? It's a pretty common thread in many religious upbringings.
And that's precisely what Dawkins takes issue with. He argues that instilling that kind of fear, especially in young children who are still developing their understanding of the world, can have a profound and potentially damaging impact.
It's hard to deny that fear is a powerful motivator. It's often used in religious contexts to encourage adherence to certain doctrines and practices.
Right. But Dawkins argues that relying on fear, especially the fear of eternal punishment, can lead to anxiety, guilt, and a skewed perception of reality. He believes it's far healthier, both for individuals and for society as a whole, to foster a sense of morality and meaning that's grounded in compassion, reason, and a respect for our shared humanity. But for all his criticisms of religion, for all the hard questions he raises, Dawkins isn't advocating for a bleak, nihilistic worldview. He's not saying that life is meaningless without God. In fact, he ends the God delusion on a note of hope, focusing on this idea of finding wonder and meaning without religion. Yes, and this is an important aspect of Dawkins' work that often gets overlooked. He's not promoting a cold, sterile worldview devoid of awe or inspiration. Quite the opposite, in fact.
So where does this sense of wonder and inspiration come from in a secular context? Where do we turn when we're searching for meaning and purpose outside of a religious framework?
He suggests looking to science, not just as a source of knowledge, but as a wellspring of awe and inspiration.
Science. But isn't science all about cold, hard facts, about dissecting things, analyzing them? Where's the wonder in that?
See, that's the thing. Dawkins argues that understanding the natural world, not through myths or stories, but through the lens of scientific inquiry, can actually deepen our appreciation for its beauty and complexity. It's like when you really understand how something works, how intricate and interconnected it all is, that's when the real awe kicks in.
Okay, I think I see what you mean. It's like that feeling you get when you look up at a night sky full of stars and grasp the sheer vastness of the universe, or when you learn about the intricate workings of the human body and realize that every cell has a specific purpose, a job to do. Suddenly, it's not just a bunch of random processes, it's a symphony of interconnectedness.
Exactly. Dawkins uses those very examples, the vastness of the cosmos, the intricacies of biology, to show that we don't need supernatural explanations to be awestruck by reality. He even quotes Douglas Adams, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy guy.
Oh, sure, one of my favorites.
Well, Adams wrote something like, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?"
Huh. I love that. It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest explanation, the one that doesn't require any leaps of faith, is the one that allows us to truly appreciate the wonders that are right in front of us.
Precisely. But I get it. For many people, the idea of finding comfort and solace in a purely secular worldview, in the absence of a higher power, can be a tough pill to swallow, especially when faced with hardship, with loss, with those big existential questions that inevitably pop up throughout life.
It's true. When we're struggling, when we're looking for answers, it's natural to seek comfort in the idea of something bigger than ourselves, something that transcends our finite existence.
Dawkins understands that. He acknowledges that religion has provided comfort and solace to countless people throughout history. But he also suggests that the kind of comfort offered by religion sometimes comes at a cost, because it often relies more on faith than on facts, on hope rather than on evidence.
So he's saying that while religion might provide temporary comfort, it might not hold up in the long run when we're faced with harsh realities or uncomfortable truths.
In a nutshell, yes. He argues that building our worldview on a foundation of reason, evidence, and critical thinking, even if it means confronting difficult realities, might ultimately lead to a more authentic, more enduring form of solace and peace. It's about finding meaning in the here and now, in the face of our own mortality, rather than pinning our hopes on something beyond this life.
So instead of looking for preordained answers or the promise of a blissful afterlife, we're encouraged to find meaning in our relationships and our passions and the contributions we make to the world, to embrace our finite existence and find joy in the everyday miracles that surround us.
That's the heart of it. Dawkins is essentially advocating for a shift in perspective, a reevaluation of what truly matters. He's saying that acknowledging our mortality, accepting the preciousness of this one life we have, should motivate us to live it to the fullest, to find joy in the smallest of things, and to strive to leave the world a little bit better than we found it.
It's a powerful message, one that calls on us to face life's big questions with courage, with open minds, with a willingness to sit with uncertainty, and above all, to approach the world with a deep sense of wonder and appreciation for this incredible, improbable journey we're all on.
And I think that's what makes the God Delusion so compelling, even for those who might not agree with all of Dawkins' conclusions. It pushes us to examine our own deeply held beliefs, to question our assumptions, and to engage in a process of intellectual and spiritual exploration.
It's about finding that sense of wonder and meaning in unexpected places.
Exactly. Like, take the concept of evolution itself, this idea that life on Earth has been shaped over billions of years by this incredible process of natural selection, of adaptation. It's a story that's constantly unfolding, constantly revealing new layers of complexity.
And it's a story that we're all a part of. Every living thing on this planet, from the smallest microbe to the tallest tree, shares a common ancestor. It's mind-blowing when you really think about it.
It really is. And Dawkins would argue that understanding these scientific truths, these elegant explanations for the world around us, is far more awe-inspiring than clinging to ancient myths and stories.
It's about embracing the mystery, the unknown, without feeling the need to fill in the blanks with supernatural explanations.
Right. It's about acknowledging that there are still things we don't know, questions we haven't answered, and being okay with that uncertainty.
It's about approaching the world with a sense of curiosity, with a thirst for knowledge.
And with a sense of humility, I think, recognizing that we're just one small part of something much, much bigger than ourselves. But here's the thing. I can already hear some people listening and thinking, okay, but what about those moments when science just isn't enough? You know, when we're facing grief, loss, when we need a source of comfort, of hope.
Those are the moments when a lot of people turn to faith, to the idea of a loving God who's watching over us, offering comfort in times of need.
Exactly. And I think it's important to acknowledge that for many, religion provides an invaluable source of strength and solace. But Dawkins would argue, and this is where things might get a little challenging, that relying solely on faith, on the promise of a divine plan or an afterlife, can sometimes prevent us from fully engaging with the reality of our situation, from truly grappling with the complexities of life and death.
So he's not saying that those who find comfort in religion are wrong or misguided.
Not at all. It's more about encouraging a different approach to dealing with life's challenges, one that's grounded in the here and now. It's about finding ways to cope with loss, with suffering, without relying on the crutch of eternal life or divine intervention.
And what does that look like in practice? How do we cultivate that kind of resilience, that ability to find meaning and purpose in the face of life's inevitable hardships?
I think it starts with acknowledging and accepting our own mortality, not in a morbid way, but in a way that allows us to appreciate the preciousness of this one life we have.
It's about recognizing that our time is limited, that every moment is a gift, and that we have the power to choose how we want to spend that time.
Exactly. It's about focusing on building meaningful relationships, pursuing our passions, contributing to something larger than ourselves, whether it's our community, our planet, or simply making someone else's life a little bit brighter.
It's about finding joy in the everyday moments, the small acts of kindness, the simple pleasures that make life worth living.
So, in a way, Dawkins is challenging us to redefine what it means to live a meaningful life, to find purpose and fulfillment outside of traditional religious frameworks. It's about embracing our humanity in all its messy, complicated glory. And on that note, I think we've just about reached the end of our deep dive into Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. It's been quite a journey. We've covered a lot of ground, from the improbability of the God hypothesis to the nature of morality, the allure of agnosticism, to the search for meaning in a secular world. We've explored Dawkins' critiques of religion, his challenges to conventional thinking, and his ultimately hopeful vision for a future where humanity finds solace and inspiration, not in ancient scriptures, but in the wonders of the natural world and the boundless potential of the human spirit.
It's been a thought-provoking conversation, to say the least. And while Dawkins offers a lot to chew on, ultimately it's up to each of us to decide where we stand on these big questions, to continue grappling with these ideas and arrive at our own conclusions.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. There's no right or wrong answer, no one-size-fits-all approach. The important thing is that we keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep the conversation going.
So whether you agree with Dawkins wholeheartedly, disagree vehemently, or fall somewhere in between, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to see the world in a new light. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those moments of awe and wonder wherever you may find them.